The head gypsy's voice cracked out. The girls separated reluctantly and stood facing him. The gypsy began to speak in a tone of harsh denunciation. Kerim put his hand up to his mouth and whispered behind it, "Vavra is telling them that this is a great tribe of gypsies, and they have brought dissension among it. He says there is no room for hatred among themselves, only against those outside. The hatred they have created must be purged so that the tribe can live peacefully again. They are to fight. If the loser is not killed, she'll be banished forever. That will be the same as death. These people wither and die outside the tribe. They cannot live in our world. It's like wild beasts forced to live in a cage." And while Kerim spoke, Bond examined the two beautiful, taut, sullen animals in the centre of the ring. They were both gypsy dark, with coarse black hair to their shoulders, and they were both dressed in the collection of rags you associate with shantytown Negroes. Tattered brown shifts that were mostly darns and patches. One was bigger boned than the other, and obviously stronger, but she looked sullen and slow-eyed, and might not be quick on her feet. She was handsome in a rather leonine way, and there was a slow red glare in her heavy-lidded eyes as she stood and listened impatiently to the head of the tribe. She ought to win, thought Bond. She's half an inch taller, and she's stronger. Where this girl was a lioness, the other was a panther, lithe and quick and with cunning, sharp eyes that were not on the speaker but sliding sideways, measuring inches, and the hands at her sides were curled into claws. The muscles of her fine legs looked hard as a man's. The breasts were small, and unlike the big breasts of the other girl, hardly swelled the rags of her shift. She looks a dangerous little bitch of a girl, thought Bond. She'll certainly get in the first blow. She'll be too quick for the other. At once he was proved wrong. As Vavra spoke his last word, the big girl, who, Kerim whispered, was called Zora, kicked hard sideways without taking aim and caught the other girl square in the stomach, and as the smaller girl staggered, followed up with a swinging blow of the fist to the side of the head that knocked her sprawling onto the stone floor. "Oi, Vida!" lamented a woman in the crowd. She needn't have worried. Even Bond could see that Vida was shamming as she lay on the ground, apparently winded. He could see her eyes glinting under her bent arm as Zora's foot came flashing at her ribs. Vida's hands flickered out together. They grasped the ankle, and her head struck into the instep like a snake's. And Zora gave a scream of pain and wrenched furiously at her trapped foot. It was too late. The other girl was up on one knee and then standing erect, the foot still in her hands. She heaved upwards, and Zora's other foot left the ground, and she crashed full length. The thud of the big girl's fall shook the ground. For a moment she lay still. With an animal snarl, Vida dived on top of her, clawing and tearing. My God, what a hellcat, thought Bond. Beside him, Kerim's breath hissed tensely through his teeth. But the big girl protected herself with her elbows and knees, and at last she managed to kick Vida off. She staggered to her feet and backed away, her lips bared from her teeth and the shift hanging in tatters from her splendid body. At once she went into the attack again, her arms groping forward for a hold, and as the smaller girl leapt aside, Zora's hand caught the neck of her shift and split it down to the hem. But immediately Vida twisted in close under the reaching arms, and her fists and knees thudded into the attacker's body. This infighting was a mistake. The strong arms clamped shut round the smaller girl, trapping Vida's hands low down so that they could not reach up for Zora's eyes. And slowly Zora began to squeeze, while Vida's legs and knees thrashed ineffectually below. Bond thought that now the big girl must win. All Zora had to do was to fall on the other girl. Vida's head would crack down on the stone, and then Zora could do as she liked. But all of a sudden, it was the big girl who began to scream. Bond saw that Vida's head was buried deep in the other's breast. Her teeth were at work. Zora's arms let go as she reached for Vida's hair to pull the head back and away from her. But now Vida's hands were free, and she was scrabbling at the big girl's body. The girls tore apart and backed away like cats. their shining bodies glinting through the last rags of their shifts and blood showing on the exposed breasts of the big girl. They circled warily, both glad to have escaped, and as they circled they tore off the last of their rags, threw them into the audience. Bond held his breath at the sight of the two glistening, naked bodies. And he could feel Kerim's body tense beside him. The ring of gypsies seemed to have come closer to the two fighters. The moon shone on glittering eyes, and there was a whisper of hot, panting breath. Still the two girls circled slowly, their teeth bared and their breath coming harshly. The light glinted off their heaving breasts and stomachs and off their hard, boyish flanks. Their feet left dark sweat marks on the white stones. Again it was the big girl, Zora, who made the first move with a sudden forward leap and arms held out like a wrestler's, but Vida stood her ground. Her right foot lashed out in a furious coup de savate that made a slap like a pistol shot. The big girl gave a wounded cry and clutched at herself. At once Vida's other foot kicked up to the stomach and she threw herself in after it. There was a low growl from the crowd as Zora went down on her knees. Her hands went up to protect her face, but it was too late. The smaller girl was astride her. Her hands grasped Zora's wrists as she bore down on her with all her weight and bent her to the ground, her bared white teeth reaching toward the offered neck. Boom! The explosion cracked the tension like a nut. A flash of flame lit the darkness behind the dance floor, and a chunk of masonry sang past Bond's ear. Suddenly the orchard was full of running men, and the head gypsy was slinking forward across the stone with his curved dagger held out in front of him. Kerim was going after him, a gun in his hand. As the gypsy passed the two girls, now standing wild-eyed and trembling, he shouted a word at them, and they took to their heels and disappeared among the trees, where the last of the women and children were already vanishing among the shadows. Bond, the beretta held uncertainly in his hand, followed slowly in the wake of Kerim, toward the wide breach that had been blown out of the garden wall, and wondered what the hell was going on. The stretch of grass between the hole in the wall and the dance floor was a turmoil of fighting, running figures. It was only as Bond came up with the fight that he distinguished the squat, conventionally dressed Bulgars from the swirling finery of the gypsies. There seemed to be more of the faceless ones than of the gypsies, almost 2 to 1. As Bond peered into the struggling mass, a gypsy youth was ejected from it, clutching his stomach. He groped towards Bond, coughing terribly. 2 small dark men came after him, their knives held low. Instinctively Bond stepped to one side so that the crowd was not behind the 2 men. He aimed at their legs above the knees, and the gun in his hand cracked twice. The 2 men fell, soundlessly, face forwards in the grass. 2 bullets gone. Only 6 left. Bond edged closer to the fight. A knife hissed past his head and clanged onto the dance floor. It had been aimed at Kerim, who came running out of the shadows with 2 men on his heels. The second man stopped and raised his knife to throw, and Bond shot from the hip, blindly, and saw him fall. The other man turned and fled among the trees, and Kerim dropped to one knee beside Bond, wrestling with his gun. "Cover me," he shouted. "Jammed on the first shot! It's those bloody Bulgars! God knows what they think they're doing!" A hand caught Bond round the mouth and yanked him backwards. On his way to the ground he smelled carbolic soap and nicotine. He felt a boot thud into the back of his neck. As he whirled over sideways in the grass, he expected to feel the searing flame of a knife, but the men, and there were 3 of them, were after Kerim. And as Bond scrambled to one knee, he saw the squat black figures pile down on the crouching man, who gave one lash upwards with his useless gun and then went down under them. At the same moment as Bond leapt forward and brought his gun butt down on the round shaven head, something flashed past his eyes, and the curved dagger of the head gypsy was growing out of a heaving back. Then Kerim was on his feet, and the 3rd man was running, and a man was standing in the breach in the wall, shouting one word again and again, and one by one the attackers broke off their fights and doubled over to the man and past him and out onto the road. "Shoot, James! Shoot!" roared Kerim. "That's Krylenko!" He started to run forward. Bond's gun spat once, but the man had dodged round the wall, and 30 yards is too far for night shooting with an automatic. As Bond lowered his hot gun, there came the staccato firing of a squadron of Lambrettas, and Bond stood and listened to the swarm of wasps flying down the hill. There was silence, except for the groans of the wounded. Bond listlessly watched Karim and Vavra come back through the breach in the wall and walk among the bodies, occasionally turning one over with a foot. The other gypsies seeped back from the road, and the older women came hurrying out of the shadows to tend their men. Bond shook himself. What the hell had it all been about? 10 or a dozen men had been killed. What for? Whom had they been trying to get? Not him, Bond. When he was down and ready for the killing, they'd passed him by and made for Karim. This was the second attempt on Karim's life. Was it anything to do with the Romanova business? How could it possibly tie in? Bond tensed. His gun spoke twice from the hip. The knife clattered harmlessly off Karim's back. The figure that had risen from the dead twirled slowly round like a ballet dancer and toppled forward on his face. Bond ran forward. He had been just in time. The moon had caught the blade and he had had a clear field of fire. Karim looked down at the twitching body. He turned to meet Bond. Bond stopped in his tracks. "You bloody fool," he said angrily. "Why the hell can't you take more care? You ought to have a nurse." Most of Bond's anger came from knowing that it was he who had brought a cloud of death around Karim. Darko Karim grinned shamefacedly. "No, it is not good, James. You have saved my life too often. We might have been friends. Now the distance between us is too great. Forgive me, for I can never pay you back." He held out his hand, and Bond brushed it aside. "Don't be a damn fool, Darko," he said roughly. "My gun worked, that's all. Yours didn't. You'd better get one that does. For Christ's sake, tell me what the hell all this was about. There's been too much blood splashing about tonight. I'm sick of it. I want a drink. Come and finish that raki." He took the big man's arm. As they reached the table littered with the remains of the supper, a piercing, terrible scream came out of the depths of the orchard. Bond put his hand on his gun. Karim shook his head. "We shall soon know what the faceless ones were after," he said gloomily. "My friends are finding out. I can guess what they will discover. I think they will never forgive me for having been here tonight. 5 of their men are dead." "Well, there might have been a dead woman too," said Bond unsympathetically. "At least you saved her life. Don't be stupid, Darko. These gypsies knew the risks when they started spying for you against the Bulgars. It was gang warfare." He added a dash of water to 2 tumblers of raki. They both emptied the glasses at one swallow. The head gypsy came up, wiping the tip of his curved dagger on a handful of grass. He sat down and accepted a glass of raki from Bond. He seemed quite cheerful. Bond had the impression that the fight had been too short for him. The gypsy said something, slyly, and Karim chuckled. "He said that his judgment was right. You killed well. Now he wants you to take on those 2 women. Tell him even one of them would be too much for me. Tell him I think they're fine women. I'd be glad if he'd do me a favour and call the fight a draw. Enough of his people have been killed tonight. He'll need these 2 girls to bear children for the tribe." Karim translated. The gypsy looked sourly at Bond, said a few bitter words. "He says you should not have asked him such a difficult favour. He says your heart is too soft for a good fighter. But he says he'll do what you ask." The gypsy ignored Bond's smile of thanks. He started talking fast to Karim, who listened attentively, occasionally interrupting the flow with a question. Krylenko's name was often mentioned. Karim talked back. There was deep contrition in his voice, and he refused to allow himself to be stopped by protests from the other. There came a last reference to Krylenko, and Karim turned to Bond. "My friend," he said dryly, "it is a curious affair. It seems the Bulgars were ordered to kill Vavra, and as many of his men as possible. That is a simple matter. They knew the gypsy had been working for me, perhaps rather drastic, but in killing, the Russians have not much finesse. They like mass death. Vavra was a main target, I was another. The declaration of war against me personally I can also understand, but it seems that you were not to be harmed. You were exactly described so that there should be no mistake. That is odd. Perhaps it was desired that there should be no diplomatic repercussions. Who can tell? The attack was well planned. They came to the top of the hill by a roundabout route and freewheeled down so that we could hear nothing. This is a lonely place, and there is not a policeman for miles. I blame myself for having treated these people too lightly. And Karim looked puzzled and unhappy. He seemed to make up his mind. He said, "But now it is midnight. The rolls will be here. There perhaps remains a small piece of work to be done before we go home to bed, and it is time we left these people. They have much to do before it is light. There are many bodies to go into the Bosphorus, and there is the wall to be repaired. By daylight there must be no sign of these troubles. Our friend wishes you very well. He says you must return, and that Zora and Vida are yours until their breasts fall. He refuses to blame me for what has happened. He says that I am to continue sending him Bulgars. 10 were killed tonight. He would like some more. And now we'll shake him by the hand and go. That's all he asks of us. We're good friends, but we are gachos. And I expect he does not want us to see his women weeping over their dead." Karim stretched out his huge hand. Vavra took it and held it and looked into Karim's eyes. For a moment his own fierce eyes seemed to go opaque, and then the gypsy let the hand drop and turned to Bond. The hand was dry and rough and padded like the paw of a big animal. Again the eyes were opaque. He let go of Bond's hand. He spoke rapidly and urgently to Karim and turned his back on them and walked away towards the trees. Nobody looked up from his work as Karim and Bond climbed through the breach in the wall. The rolls stood glittering in the moonlight, a few yards down the road, opposite the cafe entrance. A young man was sitting beside the chauffeur. Karim gestured with his hand. "That is my 10th son. He is called Boris. I thought I might need him." "I shall." The youth turned and said, "Good evening, sir." Bond recognised him as one of the clerks in the warehouse. He was as dark and lean as the head clerk, and his eyes also were blue. The car moved down the hill, and Karim spoke to the chauffeur in English. "It is a small street off the Hippodrome Square. When we get there we will proceed softly. I will tell you when to stop. Have you got the uniforms and the equipment?" "Yes, Karim Bey." "All right, make good speed. It's time we were all in bed." Karim sank back in his seat. He took out a cigarette. They sat and smoked. Bond gazed out at the drab streets and reflected that sparse street lighting is a sure sign of a poor town. It was some time before Karim spoke, and then he said, "The gypsy said we both have the wings of death over us. He said that I am to beware of a son of the snows, and you must beware of a man who is owned by the moon." He laughed harshly. "That's the sort of rigmarole they talk. But he says Krylenko isn't either of these men. That is good." "Why?" "Because I cannot sleep until I have killed that man. I do not know if what happened tonight has any connection with you and your assignment. I do not care. For some reason war has been declared on me. If I do not kill Krylenko at the 3rd attempt, he will certainly kill me. So we are now on our way to keep an appointment with him in Samara."